The airport was alive with its usual symphony of movement. Announcements echoed overhead, calling passengers to distant gates, while the occasional hum of suitcase wheels punctuated the din. Business travelers rushed with purpose. Families corralled children near vending machines, and staff in crisp uniforms moved with a quiet efficiency. Amidst this orchestrated chaos, Eliza Hamilton stood still, dressed in a tailored navy suit. Her posture was one of quiet confidence, the kind of composure forged over years of navigating rooms where her presence had been questioned, if not outright dismissed. Her dark skin, glowing under the fluorescent lights, drew glances, some admiring, others curious, and a few with subtle threads of judgment woven through. She was used to it. Had been for decades. Success didn't insulate her from such scrutiny, it merely made it more pronounced. Eliza reached the gate, her first-class ticket in hand. The flight attendant at the counter offered her a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile Eliza had learned to read long ago. Polite, performative, distrustful. "May I see your ticket, ma'am?" the attendant asked. Her tone clipped. Eliza handed it over without a word. Her flight had been booked weeks ago. First class was a small indulgence, a hard-earned comfort after years of building her business empire brick by brick. She had just wrapped up a grueling series of meetings and was eager to retreat into the plush embrace of the leather seat awaiting her. The attendant frowned, her eyes darting between the ticket and her computer screen. "There seems to be an issue," she said, her voice straining to sound apologetic. "Your seat is unavailable." Eliza raised an eyebrow, calm but firm. "Unavailable? I paid for this seat. And it's confirmed. It's right there, printed on the ticket." The attendant's discomfort deepened, her gaze shifting over Eliza's shoulder as though seeking reinforcement. Before Eliza could press further, a tall man in a pilot's uniform appeared. His name tag read Captain John Whitaker, and his expression was as neatly pressed as his crisp white shirt. His gray hair lent him an air of authority, one that seemed to require no effort to assert. "What's the issue here?" he asked, his tone brisk, eyes scanning the scene. He barely looked at Eliza. The attendant explained quickly, stumbling over her words. "This passenger, there's been a mix-up with her seat assignment." Eliza's patience was thinning but intact. "There's no mix-up," she interjected. "I have a first-class ticket. It's valid." Captain Whitaker finally looked at her, his gaze carrying the faintest hint of skepticism. It wasn't overt, but it was there in the tight set of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. It was a look she'd seen countless times before. A look that said, "You don't belong here. This seat is already assigned." Whitaker said firmly, "You'll need to move." The words were spoken with an authority that left little room for negotiation, as though the matter was already settled. But Eliza wasn't one to be easily dismissed. She held her ground, her voice steady. "With respect, Captain, I've paid for this seat. I have a right to sit in it." The captain's posture stiffened. His voice grew colder, his words sharp enough to cut. "Ma'am, you're causing a scene. Either you move, or I'll have you removed." The murmur of nearby passengers began to rise, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Eliza glanced around, sensing their stares, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few openly judgmental. Her hands clenched at her sides, though her face betrayed nothing but calm. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving this seat." Whitaker's patience snapped. "I don't care who you are," he barked, his voice loud enough to silence the murmurs. "Either you move, or I'll have you escorted off this plane." Then it happened. Without warning, Whitaker stepped forward, his hand landing on Eliza's shoulder. The force of his shove wasn't enough to hurt, but it was enough to knock her off balance. Enough to send a gasp rippling through the cabin. Enough to strip her of the dignity she had spent her entire life earning. Eliza stumbled, catching herself against the armrest of the nearest seat. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. She straightened slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, her shoulder throbbing with a dull ache, not from the shove itself, but from the weight of what it represented. Whitaker turned sharply, barking for security over his shoulder as he stormed toward the cockpit. The silence broke into whispers. Eliza scanned the faces around her. No one moved. No one spoke up. Some averted their eyes. Others simply stared, their expressions unreadable. When the security officers arrived, their voices were professional but firm. "Ma'am, you'll need to leave the plane." Eliza didn't resist. She didn't argue. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she let the humiliation seep into her bones. Let it simmer quietly as she gathered her belongings and followed the officers out. The whispers followed her, haunting her steps like shadows. Standing alone on the tarmac, the roar of the engines in the distance, Eliza felt something stir deep within her. It was an old, familiar anger, the kind she had buried for years, telling herself that success was the only answer, the only weapon she needed to fight back against the quiet violence of the world's judgments. But now, standing in the cool evening air, her phone buzzing incessantly in her pocket, she realized that her silence had limits. As the plane taxied down the runway, carrying its passengers and its captain to their destination, Eliza stood rooted in place, her resolve hardening with every passing second. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something far larger. And for the first time in a long time, Eliza knew exactly what she had to do. The evening air carried a slight chill as Eliza Hamilton walked out of the airport terminal. The chaotic noise of announcements and rolling luggage had faded, replaced by the hum of idling taxis and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. She stood for a moment under the dim glow of a streetlight, the events of the past hour replaying in her mind like a stubborn film reel. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her back to the present. She hesitated before pulling it out. The screen glowed with the name of her father, Charles Hamilton. It wasn't surprising. Her father always seemed to know when something was wrong, even before she told him. She let the phone ring once more before answering. "Daddy," she said quietly, her voice steady but strained. There was a pause on the other end. Then his familiar baritone filled the silence. "What happened, Eliza?" Charles's voice was calm, but she knew him well enough to hear the undercurrent of concern. Her father had never been one for theatrics. His approach to crises was measured. Deliberate qualities that had carried him from the back rooms of small businesses to the helm of a multinational conglomerate. But when it came to his family, his composure could only stretch so far. Eliza closed her eyes, taking a breath before speaking. "I was on a flight. The captain he told me my seat wasn't valid, even though I had a first-class ticket. When I refused to move, her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied it. He pushed me, Daddy, called security and had me removed." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. She could almost picture her father in his office, his pen tapping against the desk as he processed her words. It was a habit she'd seen countless times during her childhood, a subtle rhythm that belied the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, but there was an edge to it that made Eliza's chest tighten. "He pushed you?" "Yes," she said, her voice quieter now. "In front of everyone. Nobody did anything. They just watched." Charles inhaled deeply, and Eliza could hear the effort it took for him to keep his tone steady. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Her shoulders still ached, and the humiliation lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. "It's not the first time something like this has happened. You know that." "No," Charles said firmly. "It's not. But it will be the last." Eliza opened her eyes, staring out at the row of taxis waiting nearby. "Daddy, it's not just about me. It's about people like me, people who don't have someone like you to call when something like this happens." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. This was an old conversation between them, one that had taken different forms over the years but always returned to the same central theme: the quiet, insidious ways the world tried to tell them they didn't belong, no matter how much they achieved. Charles finally broke the silence. "Do you remember what I told you when you were little? When that teacher accused you of cheating because you got the highest grade in the class?" Eliza's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You told me success isn't enough. You have to own your success. Make them see it. Make them respect it. And you've done that," Charles said, his tone softening. "But this isn't just about success. It's about dignity. About making sure they know they can't treat you or anyone else like this and get away with it. Eliza leaned against the streetlight, the cold metal grounding her as she let his words sink in. Her father had spent his life fighting battles like this quietly, strategically, but always with unrelenting determination. He had taught her how to navigate a world that often saw their presence as an intrusion. How to command respect in spaces where they were rarely welcomed. But even he couldn't shield her from everything. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally, though she already knew the answer. Charles's voice was steady, but there was a steel edge to it now. "I'll start with the airline's board. They need to understand exactly who they've crossed. But this isn't just about you, Eliza. It's about a system that's allowed this kind of behavior to thrive for far too long." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I know, Eliza," he said, his tone softening again. "You've built something extraordinary. You've proven yourself time and time again. But you don't have to carry this alone. Let me help you." For a moment, she considered pushing back, insisting she could handle it on her own. But she was tired of fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. Tired of pretending that success was enough to insulate her from prejudice. So instead, she said simply, "Thank you, Daddy." They ended the call, and Eliza stood there for a moment longer, the phone still in her hand. Across the street, a group of airline employees walked by, laughing and chatting as though the evening were perfectly ordinary. She watched them until they disappeared into the terminal, then turned toward the curb to hail a taxi. As the car pulled away, she stared out the window, her reflection flickering against the passing streetlights. Her father was right, this wasn't just about her. It was about every quiet indignity, every subtle dismissal, every moment that whispered, "You don't belong here." And for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt the weight of all those moments settle on her shoulders. But beneath that weight, something else stirred. Not anger, though that was there, too, but a quiet resolve. She didn't yet know how. But she would make sure this mattered. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told, in ways large and small, that their place in the world was conditional. As the city lights blurred past, she leaned back in her seat, her mind already turning to the battles ahead. The airline's headquarters were unusually quiet, an uneasy stillness that often preceded the storm. On the top floor, behind glass walls that overlooked the city skyline, executives and public relations officers sat around a polished conference table. They were accustomed to turbulence, operational hiccups, delayed flights, even the occasional viral complaint, but this was different. The incident with Eliza Hamilton had landed on their desks like a live wire. By now, they all knew who she was, though none of them had known it at the time. A quiet ripple of awareness had spread as soon as her name was attached to the complaint. A black billionaire, a tech mogul, and, most significantly, the daughter of Charles Hamilton, a name that carried both weight and consequence in their industry. Susan Clark, the head of public relations, broke the silence. She was a sharp woman in her mid-40s, her professional demeanor honed from years of navigating crises. But even she looked uncharacteristically tense as she addressed the group. "We've confirmed the details," she began, her voice measured. Dr. Eliza Hamilton was forcibly removed from her seat by Captain Whitaker after refusing to comply with what he claimed was a reassignment. There's footage from passengers, and several witnesses have corroborated her account. Across the table, Jack Green, the airline's CEO, rubbed his temples. "Does Whitaker know who she is yet?" Susan shook her head. "Not as of this morning. He likely still thinks this was just another difficult passenger." Jack leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "He'll find out soon enough. The question is, what do we do about it?" Susan hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "We can't afford to treat this like an ordinary complaint. Dr. Hamilton isn't just another passenger. She's someone with a platform. Someone people listen to. The fact that she's Charles Hamilton's daughter only amplifies the stakes." Jack nodded, though his expression remained grim. "What are we looking at?" "A public apology isn't going to cut it," Susan replied. "Not when there's a video circulating. Not when the accusations include racial discrimination. We need to act quickly, or this could turn into a PR disaster." The words racial discrimination hung heavy in the air. No one at the table dared to challenge them. They all knew what the optics were and what they weren't. A black woman, dressed impeccably, seated in first class, being shoved by a white captain. It didn't matter what the captain's intentions were. The imagery alone was damning. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Across town, Eliza sat in her home office, the glow of her laptop casting a pale light on her face. She was reviewing emails from her legal team, who had wasted no time assembling the facts. A detailed timeline of the incident was already forming, complete with witness statements and video evidence. Her lawyer, Grace Morgan, had assured her they had a strong case. But Eliza wasn't thinking about the case, not entirely. Her mind wandered back to the looks on the passengers' faces as she had been escorted off the plane. There had been surprise, yes, but also something quieter, something more insidious, indifference. She wondered how many of them had thought, maybe she deserved it. How many had convinced themselves it wasn't their place to get involved. The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her back to the present. It was a message from her father. "Call me when you're ready." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the screen, her reflection faintly visible against the backdrop of her inbox. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, in a modest suburban home, Captain John Whitaker sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. His wife was still asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He had spent the better part of the morning replaying the incident in his mind. At the time, it had seemed like a routine conflict, a passenger refusing to comply with instructions. Whitaker had dealt with plenty of those before. But now, with each passing hour, the memory of the encounter grew heavier. The way she had looked at him, calm but defiant, her voice steady as she insisted on her right to that seat, it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He hadn't known who she was. To him, she had been just another passenger, one whose presence in first class had felt out of place. That thought lingered, unspoken but undeniable. He told himself it wasn't about her race. But even as the words formed in his mind, they rang hollow. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the quiet. It was his supervisor. Whitaker hesitated before answering. "Captain Whitaker," the voice on the other end said, tight with barely concealed tension. "We need you to come into the office. Immediately." Whitaker's stomach sank. He had a sinking feeling that whatever this was, it wouldn't end well. Blank. Underscore. Blank. By midday, the story had begun to spread. Hashtags like #justice for Eliza and #flying while black trended on social media. Amplifying the outrage, people shared their own stories of discrimination, turning Eliza's experience into a rallying point. News outlets picked up the story, and it wasn't long before Eliza's name was splashed across headlines. At the same time, quieter voices emerged, questioning whether the incident had been blown out of proportion. Maybe it wasn't about race. One commenter speculated, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Eliza saw those comments, too. They didn't surprise her. She had spent her life navigating the double-edged sword of success as a black woman, always visible, always scrutinized, always required to justify her presence. It was exhausting, and yet, she had learned to weather it. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about something larger, something systemic, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope because now, people were watching. She closed her laptop, her reflection briefly disappearing as the screen went dark. Rising from her chair, she picked up her phone and dialed her father. "Daddy," she said when he answered. "It's time to fight." The law office where Eliza met her legal team was unassuming. A building of glass and brick that blended quietly into the cityscape. Inside, the conference room was clean and spare, with large windows offering a view of the skyline. The atmosphere in the room was calm but charged with purpose. It was a stark contrast to the noisy storm brewing outside in the court of public opinion. Seated at the head of the table was Grace Morgan, Eliza's lawyer. Grace was a woman of quiet authority. Her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly. Her demeanor precise but not unkind. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Her words carried weight all on their own. The faint tapping of her pen against the legal pad before her was the only sound as the team reviewed the morning's updates. Eliza sat across from her, composed but alert. She had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation or a high-stakes investment pitch. This was personal. "This is where we stand," Grace began, her voice measured. "We have multiple passenger statements corroborating your account. Several witnesses confirm that Captain Whitaker spoke to you dismissively and escalated the situation unnecessarily. The footage from a passenger's phone is clear. He made physical contact when he pushed you. Legally, that's assault." Eliza nodded but said nothing. Her eyes focused on the folder of documents in front of her. She had already read them all. But she kept them close, as if their weight could anchor her amidst the churn of emotions beneath her steady exterior. Grace continued, glancing around the room at her associates. "This is a strong case. But it's not just about the legalities. It's about perception. The airline is already working on its narrative, trying to frame this as a misunderstanding. They'll argue that Captain Whitaker was simply enforcing protocol, that there was no racial bias." Eliza's lips tightened, but still, she said nothing. The argument wasn't surprising, it was predictable. She had heard it before. In different forms, countless times. It wasn't about race. The refrain echoed in her memory, hollow and unconvincing. "Fortunately," Grace added, "we don't need to prove intent. We only need to prove impact. The footage and testimonies speak for themselves. The way you were treated, dismissed, humiliated, physically removed, it sends a clear message. One that we're going to make sure the jury understands. Blank. Underscore. Blank." As the legal team mapped out their strategy, the airline's headquarters hummed with a different kind of energy. In a private office, Susan Clark, the head of PR, reviewed a draft of the airline's official statement. The language was carefully crafted, apologetic but non-committal, expressing regret without admitting fault. Jack Green, the CEO, leaned against the edge of her desk, his arms crossed. "It's too weak," he said after reading it. "We need to acknowledge her status, who she is. Otherwise, it's going to look like we're dismissing her entirely." Susan frowned. "If we make this about her being Charles Hamilton's daughter, it could backfire. People will say we're only apologizing because of her connections." Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just about one passenger. It's about what this says about our entire company. If we don't handle this right, it's not just a lawsuit we'll be facing, it's a loss of trust." Susan hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What about Whitaker? Do we throw him under the bus?" Jack's expression hardened. "He's already on suspension. If this goes to trial, it's out of our hands. But we can't pretend he acted alone. The system let this happen. And now the system has to pay for it. Blank. Underscore. Blank." Back in the law office, Eliza finally spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about Captain Whitaker," she said, echoing Jack's unspoken thought miles away. "It's about a system that allows people like him to feel justified in acting this way. A system that assumes I don't belong in first class, no matter how much I've earned that seat." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's why this case matters. It's not just about what happened to you, it's about the broader implications. If we win, it sets a precedent. It sends a message." Eliza's gaze shifted to the window, the city skyline stretching out before her. The weight of that message wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire career building something that couldn't be ignored, a business empire that was both a symbol of her success and a shield against the world's assumptions. And yet, even that hadn't been enough to protect her from the quiet violence of prejudice. For a moment, the room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of traffic from the streets below. Then Grace spoke again, her tone softer but no less firm. "Are you ready for this, Eliza? This isn't just a legal battle. It's a public one. The scrutiny will be intense. They'll dig into your past, your reputation. They'll try to discredit you." Eliza turned back to face her, her expression steady. "I've been under scrutiny my entire life, Grace. This isn't new. What's new is that I'm fighting back." Blank. Underscore. Blank. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza returned home and sat in the quiet of her living room. The events of the past week felt both distant and immediate, like a storm rumbling on the horizon while its first drops of rain had already begun to fall. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her over the years. Success isn't enough. You have to own it. You have to make them see it. She had lived by those words. But now they seemed to take on a new meaning. This wasn't just about her success. It was about her dignity, her humanity, and it was about ensuring that no one else would have to fight for those things in the way she had. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Eliza reached for her phone and opened her notes app. She began to draft a statement not for the court, not for the airline, but for herself, a reminder of why this fight mattered, and why she wouldn't back down. This isn't about a seat on a plane. It's about belonging. It's about being seen, being heard, being treated as equal, and it's about refusing to let anyone tell you otherwise. Eliza read the words back to herself, then set her phone down. The fight ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but she was ready. Captain John Whitaker sat alone at his kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling across the polished wood. The news was everywhere now, on television, online, even in the murmured conversations at his usual coffee shop. He had tried to ignore it, hoping it might fade into the background like so many other stories. But this one wouldn't go away. The headlines were blunt: billionaire tech mogul removed from first class. The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they carried implications he didn't want to confront. His actions, which had seemed so routine at the time, were now being dissected in ways that made him uncomfortable. John reached for his coffee mug, but his hand trembled slightly, causing the liquid to ripple. He had always thought of himself as a fair man, someone who treated his crew and passengers with respect. Yet now, he was being cast as the villain in a story he barely recognized. Blank. Blank. The airline's internal investigation had begun in earnest. In a small, windowless office at headquarters, a group of HR representatives and legal advisors reviewed statements from the flight crew and passengers. Most of the testimonies painted a consistent picture. Captain Whitaker had been abrupt, dismissive, and ultimately physical in his interaction with Eliza Hamilton. "I've worked with him for years," one flight attendant had said during her interview. "He's always been by the book. But there was something about this incident. He didn't even try to de-escalate. It was like he'd already made up his mind about her." The legal advisor, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Do you think it was racial bias?" The flight attendant hesitated. "I can't say for sure. But I know how he looked at her. It wasn't just frustration, it was dismissal. Like she didn't belong." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the table. They all knew what was at stake. If the airline was found liable, the consequences would extend far beyond this one incident. It wasn't just about Eliza Hamilton, it was about the culture they had allowed to flourish. Blank. Blank. At his home, John's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the quiet. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of his supervisor, David Ross. He considered letting it go to voicemail but thought better of it. "John," David began, his tone measured but firm. "We need you to come in for another meeting. The investigation is moving quickly, and the board is reviewing everything. They want to hear from you directly." John sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Do I need a lawyer?" David hesitated. That might be wise. The words hit John like a punch to the gut. A lawyer. He had never needed one before. Not in his decades of flying. The thought that his career, his reputation might be at risk was almost too much to bear. Blank. Meanwhile, Eliza Hamilton prepared for her own meeting with her legal team. The contrast between her world and John's was stark. She wasn't fighting to save a career, she was fighting to make a statement. Sitting at the head of the table in the same conference room where they had mapped out their strategy, Eliza listened as Grace Morgan outlined the next steps. "The airline's official statement is weak," Grace said. "They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding. But the evidence is too strong. The video alone shows clear misconduct. And their internal policies don't support Captain Whitaker's actions." Eliza nodded, her expression calm but resolute. What about the passengers? Have any of them come forward? Grace flipped through her notes. Several. Some have even expressed interest in testifying, including a woman who was sitting in first class near you. She mentioned hearing the captain say, "I don't care who you are," before pushing you. It's damning. Eliza's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. That phrase had lingered in her mind since the incident. I don't care who you are. It wasn't just dismissive, it was dehumanizing. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For John, the days that followed were a blur of meetings and interrogations. Each session chipped away at the version of himself he had always believed in. He tried to explain his actions, to rationalize them, but every word felt inadequate. I was enforcing protocol, he told the board during one meeting. Her ticket, there was a mix-up. A woman from HR looked up from her notes. Her expression neutral but piercing. Captain Whitaker, the investigation has confirmed that Dr. Hamilton's ticket was valid. The mix-up was on our end, not hers. Why did you escalate the situation? John struggled to find the words. She was insistent. I needed to maintain order. By pushing her, the woman pressed. By removing her from the plane? Her tone wasn't accusatory, but the questions were sharp enough to leave John feeling exposed. He had no answers that wouldn't sound hollow, even to himself. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back at her home, Eliza sat in her study, scrolling through messages of support on social media. The hashtags continued to trend, and stories from other passengers, some eerily similar to her own, poured in. One message caught her attention. It was from an older woman who described a similar experience decades ago, long before smartphones and social media could amplify such stories. I stayed silent. The message read, I thought that was the only choice I had. Thank you for speaking up. Eliza leaned back in her chair, letting the words sink in. This fight wasn't just about her, it never had been. It was about every person who had been made to feel small. Every person who had been told, explicitly or implicitly, that they didn't belong. As the evening wore on, Eliza picked up her phone and dialed her father. When he answered, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. They're starting to crack, she said. I can feel it. Charles's voice was calm but encouraging. Good. Keep pushing, Eliza. This isn't just their moment of reckoning, it's ours. Blank. Underscore. Blank. John Whitaker sat in his car outside the airline's headquarters, staring at the building's reflective windows. For the first time in his career, he felt unsure of his place. The confidence that had carried him through decades of flying seemed to have abandoned him. As he stepped out of the car and made his way inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was shifting in ways he couldn't control. The certainty he had once taken for granted now felt as fragile as glass. And he wasn't sure how much longer it would hold. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. It was brightly lit, its walls adorned with the solemn crests of justice. Yet the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken tension. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of observers, some curious, some quietly indignant, and others merely resigned to watch the spectacle unfold. Eliza Hamilton sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She was dressed simply, in a tailored black suit that conveyed quiet authority. To an outsider, she might have seemed detached, but those who knew her understood the measured restraint in her demeanor. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a moment in which countless unspoken injustices were being weighed alongside her own. Across the room sat Captain John Whitaker. His once confident presence diminished. His uniform, which had always been a symbol of his authority, was replaced by a plain gray suit. He looked older than his years, his hands resting uneasily on the table before him. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Whitaker barely reacted, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the table. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The proceedings began with the judge's measured voice calling the room to order. Judge Helen Carter, known for her fairness and pragmatism, presided over the case. Her gray hair was swept back neatly, and her sharp eyes moved between the two tables with quiet intensity. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her tone steady. This court is not a place for theatrics. It is a place for truth. Let us proceed with respect for that truth. Grace Morgan, Eliza's attorney, rose to deliver her opening statement. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of the story she was about to tell. Your Honor, members of the court, this case is about more than one incident on a plane. It is about the systemic devaluation of individuals based on race, status, and assumptions. My client, Dr. Eliza Hamilton, is a highly accomplished businesswoman. She purchased her first-class ticket like any other passenger, expecting to be treated with dignity and respect. Instead, she was forcibly removed by Captain John Whitaker, who made no effort to verify the legitimacy of her seat before escalating the situation. Grace paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. This case is not just about what happened to Dr. Hamilton, it is about the broader implications of such actions. It is about how power and prejudice can intersect in ways that strip individuals of their humanity. Blank. Blank. Whitaker's lawyer, Richard Holt, rose next. His voice was smooth, practiced. Your Honor, this case is being framed as an issue of systemic discrimination. But at its core, it is about a misunderstanding. Captain Whitaker was following protocol, ensuring the safety and order of his flight. There was no malice, no bias, only a captain doing his job under difficult circumstances. Holt's words were careful, deliberate. He didn't deny what had happened, but he sought to strip it of its broader meaning, reducing it to a procedural error. But as the testimonies unfolded, it became clear that the incident could not be so easily minimized. Blank. Passenger after passenger took the stand, their accounts painting a vivid picture of what had transpired. A woman seated nearby recounted the tension in Whitaker's voice, the dismissiveness in his tone. He didn't even give her a chance to explain. She said, he just assumed she was in the wrong. Another witness, a middle-aged man who had recorded part of the incident on his phone, described the moment Whitaker shoved Eliza. It wasn't just unnecessary, it was demeaning. You could see it in her face. She wasn't causing a scene, she was standing her ground. When the video was played in court, the room fell silent. The grainy footage captured the key moments. Eliza calmly showing her ticket. Whitaker's sharp dismissal, the shove that sent her stumbling back. The murmurs from the courtroom audience were soft but telling, a quiet acknowledgement of what was now undeniable. Blank. When it was Eliza's turn to take the stand, she spoke with the same composed clarity she had carried throughout the ordeal. Grace guided her through her testimony, her questions measured to draw out the details without theatrics. Dr. Hamilton, Grace began, can you describe what went through your mind when Captain Whitaker told you to leave your seat? Eliza nodded, her voice steady. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I showed him my ticket, expecting the matter to be resolved. But when he dismissed me without even looking at it, I realized it wasn't just about a seat. It was about something deeper, something I've faced many times in my life. And when he escalated the situation, Grace prompted, I felt humiliated, Eliza said, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was made to feel like I didn't belong. Like my presence in that seat was inherently suspect. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. They needed no embellishment. The truth carried its own weight. Blank. Whitaker's turn on the stand was markedly different. He seemed smaller, his once authoritative demeanor reduced to unease. Holt's questions were designed to present him as a diligent professional who had been put in a difficult position. Captain Whitaker, Holt began, did you believe at the time that you were enforcing airline protocol? Yes, Whitaker replied, though his voice lacked conviction. And did you have any reason to believe Dr. Hamilton's ticket was valid? No, Whitaker said after a pause. I didn't check. Grace's cross-examination was surgical, her tone calm but relentless. Captain Whitaker, do you often remove passengers without verifying their tickets? Whitaker hesitated. No. Then why, in this instance, did you not take the time to verify Dr. Hamilton's ticket before escalating the situation? I don't know. He admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Blank. The day ended with the court adjourning. But the tension lingered. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing as Eliza exited with Grace by her side. She didn't stop to speak, her focus resolute. For Whitaker, the walk to his car felt interminable. The questions he had managed to avoid for so long now pressed against him with unbearable force. Why didn't I check the ticket? Why did I assume? Inside the courtroom, Judge Carter reviewed the day's notes. Her expression inscrutable. She had seen many cases like this before, cases that revealed the quiet, pervasive ways prejudice could shape actions. Even unconsciously, the challenge wasn't just to deliver a verdict, but to deliver one that acknowledged the full weight of the truth. As the city settled into the quiet of night, two very different figures sat with their thoughts. Eliza, resolute in her fight for justice, and Whitaker, grappling with the slow unraveling of his certainty. Both knew the trial was far from over, but its outcome would reach far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing on the shoulders of everyone present. Outside, the hum of city life carried on as usual, oblivious to the tension within these walls. But here, in this confined space, time seemed to slow. All eyes were fixed on Judge Helen Carter as she sifted through her notes. Her expression unreadable. Eliza Hamilton sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting lightly on the surface before her. She looked calm, but the stillness of her posture betrayed the weight she carried. Her father, Charles, was seated a few rows behind her, his presence a quiet but steadfast reminder of the legacy that had shaped her resolve. Across the aisle, Captain John Whitaker sat with his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His lawyer, Richard Holt, leaned in to whisper something, but Whitaker gave no indication he had heard. The once confident pilot now looked like a man adrift, caught in the current of events he no longer controlled. Blank. Blank. The trial had been exhaustive. Witness after witness had taken the stand, their testimonies creating a mosaic of the events on that flight. The video footage had been replayed, each frame dissected. Passengers had spoken of the tension in Whitaker's voice, the dismissive way he had addressed Eliza, the shove that had sent her stumbling. And yet, it wasn't just the facts of the incident that lingered in the air. It was the unspoken layers beneath them, the quiet ways assumptions and biases had shaped the choices that day. Whitaker's defense had argued that his actions were procedural, not personal, but the evidence told a different story. When Eliza had taken the stand, she had spoken with clarity and calm. Her words had not been accusatory, but they had been unflinching. This wasn't just about a seat, she had said. It was about being seen as someone who didn't belong. I've spent my life working hard, building a career, creating opportunities for others, but in that moment, none of it mattered. To Captain Whitaker, I was just a disruption, a problem to be removed. Blank. Judge Carter looked up, her gaze sweeping the room. She adjusted her glasses, then addressed the courtroom with the deliberate cadence of someone who understood the weight of what she was about to say. After reviewing the evidence and considering the testimonies presented, this court has reached a decision. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. In the matter of assault, this court finds Captain John Whitaker guilty. The video evidence clearly shows physical contact that was unnecessary and disproportionate. A murmur rippled through the room, but the judge's voice rose above it. As for the claim of racial discrimination, while direct intent is difficult to prove, the circumstances of this case point to systemic bias that cannot be ignored. Captain Whitaker's actions were not merely procedural, they were shaped by assumptions that Dr. Hamilton did not belong in her rightful place. This court recognizes that such biases, whether conscious or unconscious, are harmful and must be addressed. Whitaker's head dropped, his shoulders sagging further as the judge's words settled over him. Holt placed a hand on his arm, but it was a hollow gesture. The judge continued, her voice steady. Captain Whitaker is hereby sentenced to 6 months of community service, focusing on education about racial equity and implicit bias. Additionally, he is fined for damages and will be permanently barred from employment within this airline. She paused, her gaze shifting to the airline's representatives seated in the gallery. The airline is ordered to conduct a thorough review of its policies and implement mandatory bias training for all employees. A public apology to Dr. Hamilton will be issued, along with restitution for damages. Blank. For a moment, the courtroom was silent again. Then the murmurs began, soft, restrained, but unmistakable. Eliza sat still, absorbing the verdict. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. This wasn't about triumph. It was about acknowledgement. About the slow, deliberate work of making something wrong into something right. Whitaker remained motionless, his hands still clasped in his lap. He had expected consequences, but the reality of them felt heavier than he had imagined. The words, racial equity, echoed in his mind, carrying with them a quiet sting. He had always thought of himself as someone who treated everyone equally. But now, he was being asked to confront the uncomfortable possibility that this wasn't true. Blank. Blank. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters clustered near the steps, their cameras aimed at the doors. When Eliza emerged, flanked by her lawyer and her father, the flashes began immediately. Questions flew, but Eliza didn't stop. She descended the steps with measured grace, her father walking a step behind her. In the car, Charles finally broke the silence. "How do you feel?" Eliza glanced out the window, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said quietly, "but it's not enough. It's never enough." Charles nodded, his gaze steady. "No, it's not, but it's something. Blank. Blank." That evening, as the city lights glittered outside her apartment, Eliza sat at her desk. Pen in hand, she began drafting a letter, not to the airline, not to the press, but to the people who had written to her over the past weeks. Messages from strangers who had shared their own stories of being dismissed, overlooked, or humiliated. People who had thanked her for standing up, for being a voice when they couldn't. Her words came slowly at first, then with quiet certainty. "This fight isn't over," she wrote. "This was one case, one moment, but moments like these happen every day. In ways big and small, visible and invisible. We have to keep challenging them, not just in courtrooms, but in our lives, in the ways we see each other, in the ways we choose to act or stay silent. Change is slow, but it starts with refusing to accept the world as it is." When she finished, she set the pen down and leaned back in her chair. The fight wasn't over, she knew that. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to peace. Not because the work was done, but because it had begun. The morning after the verdict, the city seemed unchanged. The same cars lined up at red lights. The same footsteps echoed on sidewalks. The same newspapers rested neatly folded on tables at coffee shops. But for Eliza Hamilton, the world had shifted, if only slightly. The echoes of the courtroom still lingered in her mind. The words of the judge etched into her memory. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The early light filtered through the window, catching the edges of her journal where she had written the first lines of what would soon become a speech. It wasn't something she had planned, but it felt necessary. The trial might be over, but the work it had sparked was just beginning. Blank. Later that day, Eliza stood at the podium of a modest community center, her father seated in the front row. The room wasn't packed, she hadn't wanted it to be. Instead, it was filled with people who had written to her, who had shared their stories of quiet indignities and hidden wounds. Some were old, their faces lined with years of experience and struggle. Others were young, their expressions filled with cautious hope. Eliza's voice was calm as she began to speak, the weight of her words carrying without the need for volume. "Most of you know my story by now," she said, her hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "You've seen the headlines, watched the videos, but this isn't just my story. It's the story of something much larger. Something that touches all of us in ways we often don't even realize." She paused, her gaze moving slowly across the room. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't about one captain or one airline. It was about a system of assumptions about who belongs and who doesn't. About whose presence is questioned and whose is accepted without thought. Blank. In the weeks since the trial, Eliza had received an outpouring of support, but also criticism. Some said she was overreacting, that the incident had been blown out of proportion. Others claimed she was using her status to seek attention. She had read those comments, absorbed their sting, and moved on. They weren't new, and they weren't unexpected. But what had struck her most were the stories. Letters from people she would never meet. Describing moments of dismissal. Of being made to feel invisible or unwelcome. A woman in her 80s had written about a time, decades ago, when she had been asked to move to the back of a bus. A young man had shared how he had been stopped by police in his own neighborhood. His backpack searched for no reason other than his skin color. Eliza had read those letters late into the night, their words settling deep into her bones. They were reminders that the fight was far from over. Blank. Blank. As she continued her speech, her tone remained steady, deliberate. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said. It doesn't happen because of one trial or one headline. It happens in the quiet moments when we choose to see each other, to listen to each other, to question the assumptions we carry. It happens when we refuse to let the world tell us who belongs and who doesn't. The room was silent, the kind of silence that carried understanding rather than judgment. Blank. Meanwhile, across the city, Captain John Whitaker sat in a small meeting room at a community center of his own. As part of his sentence, he had been required to attend a series of workshops on racial equity and implicit bias. At first, he had approached them with reluctance, seeing them as a punishment rather than an opportunity. But as the weeks went on, something shifted. He listened to the stories of those in the room, people whose lives were marked by experiences he had never considered. A man spoke about being followed in stores. A woman about her son being stopped by police on his way home from school. Their words weren't angry, they were quiet, matter of fact. And it was that quietness that unsettled Whitaker the most. It made the stories harder to dismiss, harder to ignore. For the first time, he began to wonder about the assumptions he had carried with him onto that plane. Assumptions he hadn't even realized were there. Blank. In the months that followed, Eliza and her father worked together to launch an initiative aimed at addressing systemic bias in industries beyond aviation. It was called Clear Skies, a name chosen to symbolize transparency and fairness. The program focused on education, offering workshops and resources for companies to examine their policies and practices. At the first press conference announcing the initiative, Eliza spoke with the same quiet conviction that had carried her through the trial. This isn't about blame, she said. It's about accountability. It's about creating spaces where everyone feels they belong, not because of what they've achieved, but because of who they are. The initiative gained traction, attracting attention from companies and individuals alike. For Eliza, it was a step forward, not a solution, but a start. One evening, as the city settled into the soft quiet of twilight, Eliza sat on her balcony, the faint hum of traffic rising from the streets below. Her father joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past months settling between them like an unspoken bond. Finally, Charles spoke. You've done something important, Eliza. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does, Charles said, his voice low. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth doing. They sat there together as the sky darkened, the lights of the city flickering to life one by one. For the first time in what felt like years, Eliza allowed herself to rest, not because the work was done, but because she knew it would continue. In the quiet of that evening, the world moved on as it always did, unaware of the small but significant shift taking place in a single apartment. It was a reminder that change often begins not with grand gestures, but with quiet resolve, and in that resolve, the seeds of something larger could take root, something that might one day grow to encompass the world.